Cool. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. I'll pray for us and then we will get started. God, thanks that we can all be here, and please help us to understand here what it means to lead people and manage people in a gospel-centered way, understand what that means and why it's so important, and then please help us to implement that and carry that out to your glory. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so that's what we want to talk about today. More specifically, creating gospel-driven, healthy work environments. So how do you lead and manage people, especially within the context of an organization, in a gospel-centered way? And that's not talked about a lot. There's a lot of good secular thinking out there on how to create healthy work environments, which is really, really worth learning from. There's a lot of common grace wisdom out there, and a lot of it is actually very exciting stuff. What's especially interesting, though, is a lot of the common grace wisdom actually echoes things that are taught in the scriptures and that are actually implications of the gospel. And the secular writings aren't able to make that connection, but it's there, and it's really neat as Christians for us to see that, flesh it out, and further, the common grace wisdom is able to help us understand more fully what it means to lead an organization in a gospel-centered way. So we are going to look at some things that common grace teaches us, but more fully see the gospel foundations to them and take them a step further. Our goal, therefore, is to learn how to lead our people in a gospel-centered way. And that's especially important because of several reasons. Skipping back a couple slides here. The fact is, God wants organizations to be led well. He especially wants churches to be led well. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that your church is not going to make the gospel impact it's seeking to make in its community if it's not led in a gospel-centered way. The reason is, if you don't lead your church in a gospel-centered way, you are out of sync with your mission to try to spread the message of the gospel and see it transform people and transform the community, but not be leading according to the gospel is like a meatball sundae. It's two things that don't go together. They're out of sync with each other. You're also creating a bad testimony and a bad witness when you're not leading in a gospel-centered way. The gospel does have things to say about how we lead others and manage people. So we need to know what they are and live by them, and as we do that, we will make a much greater impact for the gospel in our communities. There's some other reasons this matters. For example, Patrick Lencioni, he's a great management thinker, and he's talking about businesses, but what he says is there's really two things any business needs for success. It needs to be smart, and it needs to be healthy. And most businesses focus on the smart side of things, understanding finance, strategy, technology, and things like that. But those things can be easily copied. Very few businesses focus on the health part. That's what can't be copied so easily, and it's much more important because that's what makes your workplace a motivating environment and a fulfilling place for people to work, where they don't become zombies because they hate their jobs and then go home and ruin their family life because they're so exhausted from their workplace and burnt out. So it's very important to have healthy organizations, but most businesses don't focus on that. Lencioni postulates a couple reasons. First, he thinks a lot of CEOs actually think it's beneath them to focus on something like organizational health, because actually it takes character and humility and attention to the very simple things. And Lencioni just postulates a lot of CEOs think, oh, isn't that just either so obvious, or they don't want to stoop down and do what it takes. Another reason is, in many ways, it's easier to focus on the smart side, because that's what all the business schools are turning out, and it just comes a lot more naturally to a lot of people. But the competitive advantage for businesses, Lencioni points out, is focusing on organizational health. Now, as Christians and in the church, we're not running a business, but obviously what Lencioni is saying about healthy organizations applies, because organizational health is a virtue. It's not simply important because it leads to more profit and effectiveness in the business world. Rather, it's something important in its own right because it's a matter of treating people well. So above all, that's why we want to learn about organizational health and gospel-centered workplaces, because it's a matter of treating well the people you are leading and managing. That's what it comes down to, treating people well. Treating people as they deserve to be treated because they are in the image of God. It will also lead to greater effectiveness and results. So there's really two ultimate reasons all this matters. It's the right thing to do, and it leads to more effective results. But there are some other foundational issues we can consider, because I wrote the book on productivity, right? And the book focuses on individual productivity. Tonight we're talking about kind of interpersonal productivity, management, leadership. How do you do that well? What's the connection there? And the connection is this. It comes from the importance of interdependence. Most productivity books and systems kind of neglect the interdependent side. They treat productivity as a solo pursuit, something you do by yourself, and then other people, strangely, are viewed either as interruptions to be minimized or as tools to be utilized in accomplishing your tasks. Either way, people aren't seen as really part of the picture, as people who are to be treated valuable in their own right. They're seen either as tools or obstacles, which is not very honoring view of people. When I was director of strategy at Desiring God, I was tasked with redesigning the whole organization. And I thought, what an exciting task. And I wanted to do it on a gospel-centered foundation. And as I was reflecting on that, what was central to my thinking was Romans 12, where Paul says, outdo one another in showing honor. And I thought, what would it be like to build an entire organization on that principle of honoring people? So that's what I tried to do at Desiring God, started researching it, and this is really the fruit of a lot of that. And I think that's what God wants us to do, because all people are created in the image of God. That means people matter. And as good Piperites, I would imagine, you realize it's God that matters most of all, not people. But since God matters and we're in his image, that means we matter too. So we do need to treat other people as though they matter, because they really do matter. And actually the most effective organizations in history, without even knowing this and maybe even having an explicit biblical worldview, have actually been built upon the principle of respect for the individual. In the early days of IBM, that was their foundational principle. That's how they got started. That's how they became successful. Everything was based on the principle of respect for the individual. You see the opposite of that in a lot of organizations today, which I won't go into. Had a bad experience with an airline the other day. I think their operating principle was disrespect for the customer, and didn't work out very well. I wasn't able to get where I was going through them, but fortunately there was another airline that does operate on the principle of respect, and they were able to rescue me, and I was able to get where I was going. So interdependence matters immensely, and if we're going to understand productivity right, we need to understand how to be productive through people. But ironically, sometimes I get pushback here. It's frankly the weirdest thing in the world, and usually it comes from Christians that are trying to be gospel-centered, but they have a problem with the notion of treating people well. It's odd. Does anybody here have a problem with that? It's okay if you do. We'll refute it, but no judgment here. There's this notion that somehow it interferes with the gospel to treat people well. It comes from a misunderstanding of good works. So the right articulation of the gospel is we're accepted by God apart from good works. That's absolutely central to all of Christianity. Like, you can't deny that and be a Christian. Okay. But I think there are some people out there, I don't know if they're not careful thinkers or what the problem is, but they hear that and then they draw some false inferences from that. Chief among them being the inference that good works are therefore bad. So now the worst thing you can possibly do now is a good work. Heaven forbid. And I get pushback even on my blog. Whenever I blog on the Sermon on the Mount, I get people saying, well, basically, this is not exactly the way they put it, but I do word it back to them this way. They basically say things like, but Jesus doesn't want us to actually do this. The point is just to show us that we can't do it. That's an incomplete picture, because having been accepted by God apart from good works, now, as those who are his children and justified, we are created anew in Christ to do good works. So the life of the Christian is to be a life filled with good works, not good works done for acceptance with God, but good works coming out of our acceptance with God. And that's what these people are missing. They just hear we're not accepted by good works, and they conclude good works are to be no part of the Christian life. Instead, they're not a part of our justification, but they are a part of our sanctification. And they are essential for our sanctification. So, does Jesus want you to do the Sermon on the Mount? Yes, he does. It's very important. First of all, he wants you to recognize you can't be justified by obeying the Sermon on the Mount. You've already blown it. Not going to work to gain your acceptance with God by following the Sermon on the Mount. But if you obey verse 1, blessed are the poor in spirit, there's justification by faith alone. Poor in spirit, you have nothing to offer God. You have to be accepted apart from works by grace. Once you've entered the kingdom through Matthew 5:4, now you are to live in the way Jesus outlines in the rest of the sermon. So we are to care about good works as Christians just in the right way. And chief among the good works we have before us, if we are leaders, is creating workplace environments where the people we lead will flourish. That is a good work because it's serving them. It's treating them well. Creating an environment that treats people the way they ought to be treated is right and has many, many beneficial effects. And so we need to learn how to do that. And the interesting thing is it doesn't come naturally very well. There are certain principles we need to understand. The desire to treat people well, I think, in most Christians does come naturally. But how do you make that happen in a workplace is something that we need to learn. Here's a passage if someone needs other backing on why it's good to create healthy workplace environments in churches. Jeremiah 29:7, which is helpful in relation to the city and our communities, says, obviously everyone here knows this, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. So we are to seek the good of our communities. It's a command. And if we're to seek the good of our communities, how much more are we to seek the good of our churches? So this is very important stuff. Here's another way to put it. I think this is the other reason some people who have a problem with good works have a problem, because they think it somehow steals glory from God or distracts from the gospel, because then it's not Jesus in his person doing good works, it's his people. But in reality, it doesn't steal glory from God to do good for others. It is what glorifies God, as Jesus says in Matthew 5:16, let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. So if we do good works and live lives filled with good works, including the good work of creating healthy work environments, God will be glorified. And wouldn't it be great if all of the churches in Minneapolis were led even better than the businesses in Minneapolis? Wouldn't that be a great testimony to the gospel? Now someone might say, wait, but that almost puts it like a business criteria on the effectiveness of a church. Leadership. That's a misunderstanding of leadership, because leadership is first about character and treating people well, and that is the province of Christians, not just the business world. In fact, that is the expertise of Christians, right? Love is the expertise, the particular expertise of the Christian. And what I'm arguing is that good leadership is a form of love. So we ought to be able to lead better than the world and the businesses a few blocks down the road here, downtown. We ought to lead even better than they do, because leadership, first of all, comes from character and treating people well. So what a great testimony to the gospel that would be. And it just starts one by one church at a time. One awesome result of creating a great work environment is people will love their jobs. That's what you want. That's a good thing. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more of that at the end. Okay, so does the gospel, we've seen why it matters to create a healthy work environment, but does the gospel itself have anything to say about that? How we lead and the workplace environment we create? And is gospel-centered just a trendy label? And no, it's not just a trendy label. It means something. Piper, by the way, got it wrong. There's a, poor Piper. There's a clip on YouTube called "What Does It Mean to Be Gospel-Centered?" and it's a Piper clip of him talking what it means. It's not that he got it totally wrong. It's just that he missed the core of it. And I'll tell you what it means to be gospel-centered, and it's much simpler than what Piper said in that clip. But gospel-centered is not just a trendy label, but oftentimes it is not understood the way it is, and then it becomes a buzzword, empty of significance. But the gospel does have something to say about how we lead in the workplace. Before we look at this passage, I'll just tell you the essence of being gospel-centered. There's two things. First, realizing we're accepted by God through faith alone in the gospel, not by good works. So that's justification by faith alone. That's how you become a Christian. That's the first part of being gospel-centered, someone who's right with God through the gospel. The second part of being gospel-centered, though, is making the gospel the central dynamic for how you live your life. It means looking to the gospel to show you how to live. Not to show you, not that living according to the gospel makes you right with God, but now that you're right with God through faith alone, looking to the gospel to show you how to live. And Jonathan Edwards pointed this out long before Tim Keller did. Edwards points out that the gospel is not only the way by which we are saved, but the wisdom that shows us how to live. And you see this in the motivational structure of Paul's thought, where, like, for example, in Romans 15, he says, the stronger ought to bear the weaknesses of the weaker. And he bases it in the example of Christ there, because he says, for Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. So he bases how we are to treat the weaker brother in how Christ treated us. Or 2 Corinthians 8, where he's exhorting the Corinthians to give, and he exhorts them on the basis of the example of Christ. He says, Christ, for your sake, though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich. So Paul, in exhorting the Corinthians to give, points them to the example of Christ and what he did in the gospel. Not even just the example of Christ, during his 3-year ministry, but the culmination of that in his death for us as sinners. So the gospel shows us how to live, and at the essence of the gospel is love and service. And we are to therefore let those principles govern how we live our lives. That's the second thing it means to be gospel-centered. Live the way Jesus lived in the gospel. Now we see this come together in Matthew 20, 25 through 28, which amazingly is a passage on leadership. And it shows us how leadership, Christian leadership, is to be founded in the gospel and what that means. And we see both things coming together here. First, there's the ethic. To lead on a gospel-centered foundation means to let love be the principle of our leadership. That's the first thing Jesus says. He says, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So we see the ethic of love in the first part of the passage here. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. That's love, service. And Jesus points to himself as the chief example of that. He came not to be served, but to serve, and that meant death on a cross. So serving means make the needs of others your priority over your own needs. That's the meaning of service. We see that chiefly in the cross. Jesus made our needs, which was the forgiveness of sins, more important than his own comfort and ease, to the point where he was even willing to sacrifice to meet our needs. That's service. That's love. Know what the other person needs and make it more important than your own needs. So how does that apply to leadership? It means the leader needs to lead not for himself, but for the people he's leading. He needs to make their good his priority, not his own good his priority. That's what it means to lead well. And as we see here, that is based on the foundation of the gospel. Jesus grounds Christian leadership and its character in the gospel. Notice his death, of course, is not just an example. That's the old social gospel mistake. They had problems with things like sin and the wrath of God against sin, so they tried to empty the death of Christ of its saving significance and turn it only into a moral example. And then they turned Christian mission in the world into something other than what Jesus made it. They made Christian mission not, first of all, about proclaiming the lordship of Christ and bringing people to faith in him for their eternal salvation, but simply about improving social conditions, apart from proclaiming the lordship of Christ. They turned Christian mission into something that isn't even ultimately Christian. Not that it's bad to improve social conditions, but Christians are to do it in the name of Jesus and to do it in sync with the gospel and not denying the gospel as the foundation. So what I'm saying here, what Jesus is saying is, first of all, you have to trust in his death and resurrection for your salvation before you can even start living in a gospel-centered way. Okay, so that's most important. But having done that, then let the gospel and its ethic of service and love shape your leadership. So, what does the gospel say about how you lead and create a fruitful team environment? And of course, we've already seen the leading principle, which is love. Lead from love. You need to go into your workplace, whether you're an intern or on staff, and if you have another job, like if you're an intern and you also work somewhere else or anything like that, you need to have this ethic armed in your mind with you every day when you go into that job as well. Go into every day with the mindset of how will I do good for other people, especially the people that I'm leading. Go into every day with that mindset, which means what? More specifically, it means realizing that leadership is not getting things done through others, but rather is building people up in the accomplishment of the tasks. So this is key. This brings it down, makes it concrete. Leadership and management, which really are different, but leadership and management have been defined sometimes as getting things done through others. And at first that sounds good because you do have to get things done through others when you're leading. But it's incomplete because it leaves something out. It leaves the people out. It treats the people just as means. And so the more enlightened leadership and management thinkers have pointed out that leadership is actually about building people up in the accomplishment of tasks. It's tasks and people. Don't just try to get the tasks done through people. Seek to get them done in a way that causes the people to grow and be encouraged. That's what it means to have an ethic of love in the way you lead people. Build people up in the accomplishment of tasks. And that's called transformational leadership. And it's in contrast to transactional leadership, which views people simply as a means to accomplish the mission. You can notice the word transactional. Think of like a cash register. You go to the convenience store to get your 44-ounce soda or whatever, and if you go inside and you just see the cashier as a means to take your payment and you move on, that's a transaction, right? It's transactional. And leadership is not supposed to be that. Neither is paying for your gas, even, because you want to say hi. You want to be friendly, right? Friendly to the person. The aim there is build them up. So you can make that transformational as well. But Transformational leadership has at its root not using people, but doing it in a way that transforms them in the process for the good, that builds them up. So Mars Hill Church, anyone here heard of that? Mark Driscoll? So why did it fail? And obviously there's been lots of talk about that online. It all comes down to one thing, and it's just unfortunate because a lot of people that are blogging about it and talking about it and what's wrong there and stuff are saying helpful things, but almost no one is getting at the core because not enough Christians have done enough reading on leadership and understand it well enough. The heart of the problem at Mars Hill was a transactional view of leadership, especially expressed in a command and control approach, as opposed to an approach based on freedom and respect for the individual, a transformational leadership. And I saw this for years ago, before anything started coming out. I had lots of friends that work at Mars Hill, and I'd go there, and hang out with them sometimes, and just the things I would see and hear about the way Driscoll talked about people and how people would be let go within 6 months. And I knew stories of people that moved out there, uprooted their families, and 6-9 months later they were fired because of inconsequential, petty things. And Driscoll just had this attitude, and there's even a YouTube video of him talking about this of, well, we're driving a bus, and the bus runs over dead bodies. And behind the Mars Hill bus is a lot of dead bodies. And I lived in Minneapolis for 15 years, and there's lots of buses around here, and I don't know any bus driver that likes running over people. I don't know of, I hardly ever heard on the news of bus drivers having a history of dead bodies behind them. What was going on there was Driscoll seeing people simply as a means and not as valuable in their own right, and not letting the value of people be reflected in the way he led. And I don't think until that's addressed, I don't think Driscoll will be able to recover effectively. That's the fundamental issue. And I hope he will be able to see it. But that goes to how important these things are as well. God really wants his churches to be led in a gospel-centered way that values people. We need to be transformational. And one of the ways I first learned this is I was in a class and they talked about what's more important, people or tasks. And you can view it on this graph, and you got the importance of tasks over there and the importance of people over here. And if you have a manager that treats tasks as unimportant and people as unimportant, nothing's getting done. It's a miserable environment. People are mistreated and nothing's getting done. Then you got other management approaches. They treat tasks as all important and people as not at all important. And that's where you have environments, people being treated like machines. And it's miserable. Then you got the opposite extreme of that, a manager who really, really values people but sees that as in conflict with valuing tasks. Maybe kind of like The Office when it was on the air, and Michael Scott. And he was always trying to be liked and make people like him and be happy to have a good work environment, but it seemed like nothing was really getting done. That's a country club management style. And that's not good either. That's not serving people either. So when I talk about transformational leadership, I'm talking about something, it's not first evident. At first we think there's a trade-off between valuing tasks and valuing people. And if you value people more, you got to value tasks less. And if you value tasks more, you got to value people less. And that's a false dichotomy. Instead, you can value tasks and people equally, and that's transformational leadership. And the way that coheres in your mind is, again, going back to what I was saying, seek to build people up in the accomplishment of tasks. So, transformational leadership. Now, how do you do this? How do you build this? How do you create an environment like that? First, have that mindset, obviously. But beyond that, seek to empower people. There's really two main things. These are the two things at the heart of a healthy workplace. And the first is empowerment. That means giving people the right to act and developing their capacity to act. Empowerment has become a buzzword, right? And when things become a buzzword, they start to get ignored. And you have people instead of utilizing the concepts, they say things like, man, I just hate that word empowerment. Boy, I have to write it here, but I really don't want to. And that's unfortunate. Empowerment has become a buzzword, not because it's a trite concept, but because lots of people have used it and repeated it without knowing what it means. And they made it look trite. But in reality, it's not trite. When you actually understand what it is, it's amazing and incredible. Empowerment simply means, again, giving people the right to act. So let people make choices. Don't create detailed rule books trying to dictate the move of every person lest they make a mistake and cost the organization some money or time or whatever. You have to let people use their judgment. Tim Ferriss, who wrote the book The 4-Hour Work Week, which I quote a few times, and What's Best Next, talked about how when he had his online business, at first he was overwhelmed with email because all the customer service people were continually asking him questions. A customer has this problem. Can I do this? Can I do that? And it was sinking him. And finally he said, look, if it's going to cost less than $200 to solve the customer's problem, you have the authority to do it. And immediately he quit being inundated by all these requests because his people were empowered. And what he found is it didn't waste his money. Instead, it freed up his time and the customers were more satisfied. That's empowerment. One reason a lot of organizations don't like to empower their people is because they feel it's risky. But I think John Piper is right, who writes in his book, Don't Waste Your Life, that risk is right. There's a whole chapter called Risk is Right. We can't let risk keep us from doing the right thing. And what you find usually, especially in the case of empowerment, is that what seems risky actually pays off far better in the long run. Stating this as a general principle, the best way to manage people is seek to maximize their freedom and enable them to manage themselves using their judgment rather than managing them through command and control. And we're going to talk about that a little bit because it leads immediately to the question, okay, how do you create empowerment even a little more than just giving them, the authority to act? What's it really mean to maximize freedom and let people manage themselves? Won't they go off the rails if they manage themselves? How will they know what to do? All that boils down to understanding how to create empowerment, and it comes from this, the second component of a healthy organization, which is trust. So I even have a blog post saying the heart of a healthy organization is trust. So if you want your church to be healthy, or any place you lead, if you want it to be healthy, you need to make trust be the foundation of your leadership and the foundation of the organization. Trust pays off dividends because, among other things, it's incredibly motivating. To be trusted is a motivating thing. It makes you take ownership, makes you want to do good, because you don't want to let the person down. Trust also gives you freedom, and people need freedom in order to be motivated. You diminish freedom too much, you demotivate people. You trust them, you give them a larger arena of freedom, more ability to act and exercise their personality and their judgment, and that's more motivating. Now we can say, but is there a limit to how much you can trust people? We'll talk in just a little bit about the importance of a framework. It's not anarchy. Trust does not equal anarchy. Freedom does not equal anarchy. It's freedom within a framework, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But first we need to ask, why can you trust people? And it comes down to theory X and theory Y. These are two different theories about human beings. And this was crystallized in, I think it was the 50s or 60s by Douglas McGregor, a great management thinker and human relations thinker. And theory X views people as basically lazy and wanting to avoid work. Whereas theory Y views people as, for the most part, wanting to do good work and accept increased responsibility when they can. So these are two different views of human beings. And if you hold theory X and you think most people want to avoid work, then how are you going to lead them? Through force, through command and control. So if you are in charge of an airline and you think most people are out to cause problems and avoid work, you're going to have detailed regulations and give them very little autonomy. And you're going to try and motivate them through carrots and sticks. The great jackass theory of motivation. Carrot in the front, stick in the back. That's how you motivate mules and animals not people. Rewards and punishments. There is a place for rewards and punishments, but it's not to be the chief means of motivation. But that's how you will motivate people if you think they don't want to work. Like if I need someone to, go get me a coffee, if I think they're naturally disinclined to not want to help, then I might try to force them, through threat of, get this coffee or else you're going to be fired, or I'll write you up if you don't do it, or, that's kind of a silly example because coffee is such a small thing, but that's how you end up motivating people if you think they don't want to do good work. And that's why so many companies are miserable places to live, because that's not a fun context to work in. And I've worked in those contexts, and I know firsthand it is not fun. Now, theory Y says most people naturally want to do good work and excel. And if you hold a theory Y view, you're able to trust people. Because if you think they naturally want to do good work, you don't need to create a bunch of rules and minimize their freedom, because you're not worried about them abusing it and goofing off. Instead, you realize if you give them greater freedom, they will use that well in order to further the purpose of their work, as long as they know what the purpose is. Theory Y is the correct theory. Studies have shown this out. It's maybe 4 or 6% of the population which falls into theory X. The vast majority of people operate according to theory Y. One of the problems, though, is that these theories are self-fulfilling. So if you get a group of people and treat them according to theory X, treat them like children, they will live down to the expectations placed upon them. And then the person says, oh, look, theory X is right, because look, all these people are acting like children. It's self-fulfilling. But if you give people freedom and trust them, they will live up to that. So these are self-fulfilling in many ways. The key point is avoid the horrible, dehumanizing theory X. And it's also what ruined Detroit, which we won't talk about. Now, as Christians, an important question here, though, is how does this relate to sin and the doctrine of total depravity? Because you would think that because of sin, maybe theory X is true, right? Well, wrong, because of common grace. And the image of God is still in man. It's defaced, but it's still in man. The doctrine of total depravity doesn't mean everybody is as sinful as they can be, or is outwardly sinful in every conceivable way. It means that sin has affected every aspect of our being. And everything the non-believer does is sin, not because they're always lazy or trying to avoid work, but because they're not doing what they're doing to the glory of God. So, recognizing that most people, even non-Christians, do want to do good work is not inconsistent with the doctrine of original sin. Instead, it means their desire to do good work, which is a form of civic good, it's still ultimately sin because it's not for the glory of God. But that doesn't mean they don't want to do good work. So you don't need to ditch theory Y in order to uphold the doctrine of original sin. You just need to understand what original sin and total depravity really mean. So it is very consistent with theory Y. There was someone who wrote a booklet on laziness a few years ago. I was reading part of it. And in this booklet, they talked as if every Christian is lazy. And their thinking was kind of like, well, we're all sinners, right? And then they drew this false conclusion that therefore we all express the same sins to the same degree. Well, I believe as radically in the doctrine of total depravity as Jonathan Edwards, John Piper, or any other Reformed theologian. And I will tell you, that does not mean, though, that every Christian is lazy or every person is lazy. Sin expresses itself in different ways in different people. Maybe everyone has aspects of laziness to various degrees, but it doesn't mean it's the major sin of every person. Just like not every person has a major issue with anger, which is a sin. We don't say everyone's a sinner, and therefore you must have a big problem with anger. That doesn't make sense. So same with laziness. So how is this all gospel-centered, theory X, theory Y? Well, the image of God in man leads people to a theory Y view. But as Christians and in the church, we have an even greater reason to embrace theory Y, and that's because the gospel has freed us from sin. It hasn't made us perfect, but it's freed us from sin, and we have the Holy Spirit in us. Now we are all the more desirous of doing good. And so Christians can be trusted with freedom. And we know this especially from the book of Galatians, where Paul teaches us that freedom is at the heart of the gospel. He says, for freedom Christ has set us free. And he talks about how God treats us, not as slaves, but as sons, and how we're to be motivated not by fear, but by love, living as children of God, not slaves of God. To live as a slave of God is to put yourself under the law. The gospel redeems us from sin and the tyranny of the law so that we can walk according to the Spirit. That doesn't mean there's no place for law. As Calvin said, there's the third use of the law. It shows us the path. But it's no longer about the code. It's about acting from love and out of desire. So the point here is, since God treats us this way, as people who want to follow him and do good, treats us as sons, not slaves, we should treat each other that way. And therefore we have a solid foundation because of the gospel to give great freedom to the people we manage in the church, especially in the church. What we need in order to do this, to close, is just a few practical tools. Because I think I've made the case for the importance of freedom. Give people high freedom. And there's a new book out by the head of HR at Google called Work Rules. And in there he argues high freedom yields high performance. And it's an awesome book. And he's saying, a lot of similar things. I haven't read all the book yet. But the same concept. The way to lead people well is to maximize the freedom you give them. And that results in high performance for all the reasons we've talked about. But there's one big question, of course. If you give people too much freedom, how will they know what to do? And that's an important question. And that's why we need to recognize the concept here is freedom within a framework. The framework is not the point. The aim of the framework is not to guide, but it is to assist. We need helpful systems and structures, not overbearing systems and structures. So you want to give people a framework, a structure within their freedom is to operate. And the first way to do that is to have a mission statement. And a mission statement that actually works. A lot of organizations, they write these long mission statements and put them in plaques on the walls. And I think the point of that is for them just to say that they have a mission statement. And that's not a good way to do it. The mission statement has to come from the heart and be descriptive of what the organization's mission actually is. And I forgot to check the website of Hope before I got here, which normally I do, but I imagine you guys have a mission statement. Do you? What is it?
To honor God by helping as many people as possible become fully devoted followers of Jesus Christ.
Excellent. Boom. You got it. So that's a great mission statement, and it's simple, it's biblical, and you mean it, and you can remember it. So when the mission is clear to people, then they really have freedom to act because they know how to direct their freedom. And this is really how John Piper led Desiring God, because he wasn't able to give a lot of time to Desiring God because his focus was on Bethlehem, obviously, as it should have been. So how did he lead Desiring God? He kept putting the mission statement before us. And we knew that as long as we were acting in accord with the mission statement, we wouldn't be rebuked for what we were doing, because the mission statement was our authorization. Do something outside of the mission statement, then why are you doing that? But as long as you stay within the mission statement, you have the freedom to act. And our mission was to spread a passion for the supremacy of God in all things for the joy of all peoples through Jesus Christ. So mission statements. And then second, this is helpful, team charters, like if you're running a department or just have a team and a project. And a team charter is just the statement of purpose, really, and values for your team. So on there you put the mission, this team exists to why? And values, we stand for what? And then just 3 or 4 things. What are the things we stand for? Creativity, excellence, the glory of God. Values are like a framework for behavior, principles for behavior. Measures, it's helpful to know how to measure your success, and then maybe have some 3-month objectives so people know how this all translates down to the immediate future. So team charters, they're wonderful ways of providing direction. And then how do you manage someone once they have a team charter? You let them be free. You let them operate according to the charter, and you don't micromanage them. And then the last and the third is win-win performance agreements, so job profiles. But Stephen Covey calls them win-win performance agreements because that's a more helpful phrase. And what you do, if you have a good performance agreement, which creates the framework in which they are to operate so they know what their role is, then people manage themselves within the context of the agreement. So the essence, so notice how this flips, and this gets at the heart of servant leadership. The leader becomes the follower. So if you understand these principles and create a performance agreement with an employee in your department, who is managing that employee? They are. Within the context of the agreement, the employee is managing himself or herself. Now, what's the role of the manager then? Not to be a boss, but to be a source of help, to identify obstacles and help get those obstacles out of the way. And, of course, to provide the overall context. But that gets at the heart of servant leadership. Create a context in which the person can manage themselves. And when they are able to do that, that develops their judgment, because they have to rely on their resourcefulness and creativity in order to figure out the best way to accomplish the objectives and to assess themselves. How am I doing? They are managing themselves, and that is, in essence, how character grows. And that's how God manages us. I mean, have you ever wondered why the Great Commission hasn't progressed any further yet? And why doesn't God just step in and get it done? It's because God manages this way, according to gospel-centered, people-centered management, stewardship delegation rather than gopher delegation. He treats us as stewards. He entrusted us with the Great Commission. He defined what the task is. He's empowered us to do it. He's not going to step in and micromanage. And we really need to step up to the plate and start doing a better job. But if God came in and just took it over and finished it himself, he wouldn't be building up his church. He wouldn't be developing his church. And I think the church will rise to the task, and more in the church will take it more seriously and take ownership, and we will get it done and see in the long term stewardship delegation is and was the best choice by God in order to accomplish the Great Commission. So people manage themselves, and there's 5 components, and this is in the book, in the chapter on delegation: desired results, guidelines, resources, accountability, and consequences. That last one should be consequences, not resources. So that is stewardship, delegation / win-win performance agreements. The last issue, and then we'll have maybe a little bit of time for questions, is the results of this, the results of an empowering, gospel-centered work environment. And it's not only that people will enjoy coming to work and be built up. Ultimately, it comes down to one main thing, which apparently I forgot to create the slide for, but it's this. As we lead our organizations in gospel-centered ways, God transforms the world socially, economically, and spiritually. So this is part of God's mechanism through which he transforms the world and renews culture. And if we manage our churches and other organizations this way, we will see God making that amazing impact through our leadership. So I remember we're done at 6. If I'm right on that, then we got a couple minutes for questions.
We could probably take 5 minutes as long as they're
Okay, great.
I don't want you to have 10 minutes and then just sit in awkward silence.
Yep, that's good.
Go ahead and I'll get the stuff ready.
Okay. All right. Questions, objections, comments, observations? You can ask a question on the problem of evil too, or the Trinity, or anything really. I like all sorts of questions.
How do you, you're right there.
Yeah, okay.
How have you found it helpful to come along, to give, a lot of things you said are great, because there are a lot of similar, we might just say different terminology, but, giving people a framework, we kind of use fence lines. A lot is kind of our terminology, trying to give people boundaries to run within, but then let them run.
Yeah.
How would you say, in what ways have you found it helpful? Because some people really thrive in that environment. They're like, hey, I really like really big fence lines. And then you let me run. And some people it's like, oh, no, I perform better in a place with smaller fence lines and a lot more of this framework. And how would you say for people who, maybe autonomy is not necessarily a gifting or they don't really thrive in that kind of environment?
Yeah.
How would, just observationally, things of your experiences or anything you recommend to manage or care for those people?
Yeah, a couple things. Back in the 5 components of stewardship delegation, the second is guidelines. And that's important. Guidelines show, they give the person principles for what works and what doesn't work. And what you want to do is give more guidelines to the less mature and less guidelines to the more mature. So that's one principle. Then there's also the issue of just, with greater autonomy comes greater responsibility. I don't think the issue is that there are some people out there that don't thrive with autonomy per se. I think everybody thrives with autonomy. The question is, how much responsibility do they really want? Some people have other priorities in their lives where they don't want their job to be a massive responsibility, and that's okay. Other people do have certain preferences. They don't want to have to be managing a lot of latitude. That's okay. And you put them in jobs that don't require the high levels of autonomy. But it doesn't mean you micromanage them. It's that you're giving them jobs, in one sense, with less responsibility. I don't mean less significance. Like an assistant to a CEO who's, managing his schedule, entering, the appointments in his iCal. That's very important work. She gets one of those appointments wrong. It screws up a whole meeting. That's a big deal. But it's also a very clearly defined task. She doesn't have to figure out how to do that afresh. She doesn't have to innovate. So in a sense, that's a task with less autonomy. And that's okay. So someone who doesn't want as much autonomy, put them in roles that require less autonomy. But that's how I would frame the issue. It's not about some people want to be, not that you're saying it this way, but it's not that some people want to be micromanaged and some people don't. The issue is, levels of responsibility, because that's a lot of what it comes down to. High level of autonomy, especially without the proper support, it can bring a level of stress, because now you are having to define what to do more and more. And some people want that level, want higher levels than others. But like for department heads, for example, you got to have people that want the high responsibility. There's no other way to lead a department well. Yeah, so good question. Yep.
This is similar, but the theory X versus theory Y, you said like 4 to 6% or something like that, isn't it?
Yep.
X. So for people who are on that side of things, would you say, if you're like hiring, would you say you just don't hire in people that are like that, or you just hire them quickly, or is there's something that can change people?
Yeah, that's right. Don't hire that 6%. And I would argue that is a moral problem. Not hiring them, but that the person has, and that can be fixed. But don't hire that 6%. And that's one of the reasons there are screening processes in hiring. But what do you do if they're already on staff somewhere? And then you can't just fire someone willy-nilly, and you can't just, even if they look like that 6%, you can't just say, oh, well, they definitely are. Maybe there are other issues going on in their lives. Maybe they're having personal problems that's affecting their work. Maybe they're in the wrong role. So what you want to do is explore. And it needs to be objective, can't be subjective. It needs to be based on actual performance, and that's why you want to have goals defined. And then you talk with the person about their performance issues and come up with a plan with them for addressing those issues, and let them have a genuine opportunity to address them. And if they do address them, you kept your employee. If they don't address them, you meet with them again, identify was something wrong with the plan, and try and tweak the plan. Give them another chance with a tweaked plan. And if they still can't get it together, and there isn't, some mitigating factor, death of a spouse or something like that, it's just really a performance issue, and a different job isn't going to solve it, then yeah, you got to let the person go. But the important thing is, before letting them go, you give them a chance, and when you do let them go, it's based on objective measures, objective criteria. Yep. Yeah. Yep.
You got any tips for managing up in a way, or like, like let's say you're an intern at a church or something, and
Yes. Right.
I'm joking. Hypothetically
So you're
speaking.
not
There's just
actually.
that one person on staff. Just can't stand.
We'll call him John Young.
Yeah.
Managing up.
Hypothetically.
It's a
Yeah.
common name.
Awesome. Yeah, right?
No,
Yeah,
I'm all
it's a great
serious. I mean,
question.
just like if you aren't in a position where you're making the
Yes.
ability to like shape culture in some ways, you're having
Yeah.
that ability.
Yep, that's right.
right.
Yep, that's great. Yeah, so it is very important to manage up. So you need to manage down if you have people that you're manage side to side, and manage up. And especially when there's lots of interns, it's a very important question. How do you manage up? So first, a couple things. Number one, you need to know good leadership and management practices so you can support them. So when you see the person who's managing you operating according to good principles, you want to be supportive of that and affirming of that. So you'll get more of it, and you're helping them in their management when you affirm that. And when you have the chance to get input, you want to give input on the basis of such principles, correct principles. Second, for managing up, one of the most important questions you can ask your boss is, why am I on the payroll? Or if you're not paid, if it's not a paid internship, why am I on staff? Why am I part of the team? What is the chief thing you want from me? Ask them that, and hopefully that's already clear. But even if it was made clear at the start or whatever, it's always a good question to ask again periodically. And that will help you know what you should be focusing on. So you don't have to focus on 1,000 things. It helps prioritize. So ask your leader, your manager, why you're on staff, the chief reason, and then orient your activities around that. And then third is what not to do. Don't simply seek to be compliant. It's really good. Obviously, you want to do what you're told, obviously, and every manager loves that. When they delegate a task and the person does it right away without complaining, grumbling, that's awesome. But don't limit the definition of effectiveness in your role to that. Because the best interns and employees are those who take initiative, who proactively identify needs before they're told. So have that mindset. Try to anticipate the needs of, if you're on a team, or anticipate the needs of your team, anticipate the needs of your leader, and address those things and take initiative and show creativity. And those three things are among the most important elements for leading up, and those are the type of people that gain more responsibility. And then when you are leaders, not that you're not leaders already, because you are. I think leadership is a function of character and influence, not first formal authority. But when you do have that formal authority, lead according to these principles, not according to other principles, not according to a micromanaging theory or a theory X. And up to that point, keep refining your understanding of leadership and management. Learn those things so that, when you are in a position of formal authority, you're like ready to go. You got this stuff clear, and wow, what a big difference that will make. Yeah, good question.
Will help a lot. I mean, the guy kind of just called John. Let's do one more round of applause for Matt.